So, Carson, are you proud of me that I started forking over my money to Meta on a daily basis once again? My own money, not just my clients' money.
It's the destiny of every artist.
Every artist, every media person, everything.
That's what we all aspire to do. We just you've transcended. I am proud of you.
Thanks. Yeah, I started spending the Rhythm Changes ad budget again to try and get more people to sign up for free. And it's working just as well as it did before. I took like 3 months off of doing it so that I could save a little bit of cash. And because I had one ad in particular that I don't know, maybe I have excluded you from being shown this or some other people, or maybe not. But there's one ad in particular where I have a pretty fresh haircut and I'm walking up the hill here, Coquitlam, and I'm talking without reference to a specific month. This is one of the first ones I recorded about how you should sign up for the gig list if you want to enjoy creative music shows in Vancouver. And this ad has had like over 1 million impressions because Meta Ads Manager just loved it and would refuse to show anything else other than this ad. I tried to cut new videos of myself saying like, oh, the gig list is out for the month of November, December, January, and other things, and nothing could defeat this ad. So that was another reason why I took some time off. But now the new ones I'm putting out, they are getting shown. So there you go.
Congrats. That's very funny how it picks and chooses. I wonder what specifically was what it was about that one. I don't think I've seen it. I think I have some pretty elaborate ad blocking set up on my home network, and I don't use the Instagram app. I just use the web browser, and so I actually don't get seen I don't see a lot of ads.
That's a good strategy. That'll absolutely do it. Yeah, and if you're not spending time in the Facebook app, then you're missing it there too. So definitely exposure on both, but you are working around that. So there you go.
Yeah, I find it very striking when I switch devices or switch networks. The amount of ads that are out there in the world that make the web not super usable. I mean, those are good ads. I would love to see your smiling face walking up a hill in Coquitlam telling me about the gig list. But man, the rest of the internet, I'll tell you, full of ads.
Carson's like, yeah, I've successfully stopped you from polluting my brain, Will. Suck it.
You pollute my brain many other ways through texts and articles. I'm fully influenced. Consider me influenced by this influencer.
And we're sharing it with you now here too, because this is episode 10, which is kind of cool. That's a fun first time we can actually have a round number. So how are you doing? Are you feeling like summer yet? How's your week going?
I feel great. I feel like summer. I'm having a fun start to June. No complaints. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well too. It's really starting to feel like festival season. We're going to take a 1 week break before the festival starts, but that's still a little bit away from now. We've got a topic that we put on our docket a long time ago to talk about, and now we're finally getting around to it. And I don't know where it's going to go necessarily, but I think it's going to be fun because it unites a bunch of things that we talk about. And it is this question about labor in the arts and specifically in music. It's a funny space, a funny sector of work and activity where people wear a whole bunch of different hats, and some of those hats are very explicitly labor and some of them maybe are not. So the overly simplistic question you could ask is something like, is being an artist labor, and when or where, if you end up getting more specific than that. But this is our task for today, is to interrogate this question, and I suppose it was originally my idea. So when I put this question in front of you, what on earth did you make of it when you had to see this for the first time?
Well, I guess the first thing when being posed, is insert anything labor is like, what do we? I hate to Jordan Peterson this. What do we mean by labor?
Yep.
What do you mean? What do you mean happen? So that is sort of with my initial reaction, obviously, as someone who's done creative work and have many or most of my friends are involved in some creative work, is like, of course it's labor. Of course, not just the act of performing on a stage for an audience, not just the act of sitting in a studio making music, but all the stuff around it, right? All that we could call the entrepreneurship aspects, to me, feel like labor. There may be more loosely connected to market forces than other forms of labor. I think that's maybe where we get into some tricky territory, like in some definitions of labor. Maybe you're more directly interacting with like an outcome, or you're more direct, you're working towards an outcome, or in more market systems. But that's kind of the loose set of things that crossed my mind when you first posed the question. I'm curious how you arose at the question and maybe what your impression is of music and labor.
Well, what I see when I look out there is I see it being used conceptually to bring people together for activist causes. And there's no better example of this than if I fired up the website of the UMA, the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers that we've mentioned before, also called United Musicians and Allied Workers sometimes. And on their front page
Yep.
right now, what it says is UMA aims to organize music workers to fight for a more just music industry and to join with other workers in the struggle for a better society. So the framing of as many artistic things as possible under the umbrella of labor can help artists join in solidarity with other types of workers, and that they have enough political things in common that this can be useful. So that's where I see the question emerging out in the world and why it came to my attention. And then you
Right.
look at some of the things they try to do about that, and they talk about streaming with regards to that. They talk about other things related to touring and live performance because of that. But is this a time where we need to define for ourselves, like you said, how are we evaluating this? What does it mean if we call something labor? What is labor? Do we need to like nail something down here?
Give me your loose definition, and I'll see if I have any big protestations before we move forward.
Well, mine might be a little narrow, so that might be a problem, or it just might cause some differences when we go on. But I would say something is labor if you have an employer-employee relationship, roughly speaking, even if it isn't like
Sure.
literally that under the law, because in so many artistic areas, as the performer, recording artist, musician, it is not. And funnily enough, it often is if you're another person working into the equation, like if you're staff at a venue or if you're a crew on a tour or
Yeah.
something. I think it's super obvious that obviously you're labor. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about when is being an artist labor. And I think it is when there is an employee-employer like relationship, which means there are set wages that you earn when you go and spend time doing set things, maybe in set places or maybe not, because like there's lots of remote work out there nowadays too. But
Right.
I think there has to be set wages and set times. That's a true employer-employee relationship. And the closer you get to that, the more something is labor, in my opinion. What do you think?
I take your point. I think that's somewhat so. Like, if I just extrapolate from the point you're making, you're putting that against what you might call like entrepreneurship, where there's no employee-employer relationship. You're ostensibly working for yourself. And so, if you were to unionize with other people doing the same thing, who are you unionizing against? You are you're self-employed. That's sort of the distinction you're setting up, right? If you're not staff at a recording studio, you're the musicians coming to record at the studio, paying your own way, then you're like, it'd be hard for you to call that labor because, well, you're working for yourself.
Well, I mean, I first of all, I agree with pretty much everything you just said. So yeah, for sure, you're on the right track.
Okay.
But I think it's obvious enough, and it's not like jumping to the punchline to say that, oh, this is going to come to a head with streaming, and we're going to look at streaming, right?
Right.
And I think there's hardly anything that less resembles labor than being an artist on streaming. I think that's the furthest thing from labor there is. And it's funny that that is such the bugaboo of these advocacy groups,
Right.
and that they're trying to unite people together against streaming. But to frame it in terms of labor is weird for me. And maybe that's like the thing that first excited me about the topic or got me interested. Because, I mean, in my opinion, what you're doing when you're uploading your music to streaming and when you have it on there, it's actually like the opposite of labor. Like, you are exploiting works that you've already made without
Right.
having to put any additional labor into it. Like all the labor happened before that. And that's why I'm saying, like, is my definition too narrow? Or, I mean, that's how I see it. Like, being an artist on streaming is not labor, because you are not punching any clock for the streaming service. You're just taking things that you already own, you're putting them there.
Right. I think I will say, I think that the employer-employee relationship thing to me feels a little narrow when we're just talking. I'm sure if you were to speak to someone at UMA, they would say the act of work in general, right? I think what's tricky, and I think we talked about this when we first talked about UMA, is they like had to change their name because they're not an actual union, because to unionize, again, who are you? You're collectivizing against whom, right? In a labor union, you're unionizing. If I work at Apple and I get my Apple coworkers together and I say, hey, we want to make sure we're paid fairly and given adequate benefits, we can like unionize against Apple, and then we have some collective bargaining power. I think UMA has to abstract labor by saying, like, the things we do as artists they take work, right? Like when we're literally spending hours either, at our desks in studios, composing, playing with each other, we're doing work, right? We're doing stuff that took skill, education, even though there's no one maybe giving us an hourly paycheck to do it. And they feel that in some ways, the tech platforms, or the platforms that are kind of setting the rules about this, are in some ways acting as an employer, because there's some power over the employee. This is in the loosest sense. I actually do take your point that, like, if you're putting something on streaming, once it's on streaming, you're not working, but there was labor that went into the product that went out there.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. And I mean, I'll say, like, one reason I want to have this conversation with you is I kind of want to be convinced by you on this subject. Like, I didn't set this up to own the libs and defeat you in this debate. That wasn't the dream here.
Great.
But I mean, when I hear about what you just described from that community, it's almost like when they talk about labor, and it's almost like their definition of labor is that which isn't fairly compensated, or that which puts us on one side of a power struggle. And that's where it resembles a lot of this leftist activism that I've never enjoyed or taken part of. And so that kind of earns my skepticism just based on the bias that I'm coming into it with. But I do agree with you that there's enough work that went into it that the struggle for getting as much compensation for it as possible is worthwhile. So it's just kind of weird to frame it in terms of labor, maybe, but if I actually try to get over my initial political bias, I mean, I get where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. And I think what UMA is trying to do is to capitalize on the sense that artists have that there is an us and them relationship with tech platforms, right? In the same way that if I work at Apple, I'm not saying Apple because I used to work, like, it's just an example of a big tech company. If I work at Apple, this is just like, Apple, don't sue me. I didn't try to start any unions when I was at Apple, but
no, sir.
If I was working there and the employer on some level needs me. And so that's like your power when you're beginning to think about unionizing, right? Like, you have this collective action opportunity to work with your coworkers, and like they can't fire us all at once, right? If we come to the table and say, like, hey, we're all in agreement that we need this and this and this. And similarly to the employer-employee relationship in a labor union, there is streaming can't exist without artists. And so there is this sense that, like, they need, say, Spotify, streaming platforms, tech platforms broadly, need artists to make music. I think majors really put a kind of thorn in that whole model, right? Because I think the majors are actually not particularly worried about the exact economics of this, because majors get a pretty sweet deal with streaming. But there's this collective action opportunity where you can say, like, look, if we're all aligned that we wish we were making more money and that these streaming services need the services we provide, can we negotiate to get a better deal? Even though we don't have, I care, I guess, how much money you make from streaming because I'm your friend, but like, I don't really care how much, Two Steps Removed makes from streaming. But if that person and you and me can band together with everyone else that we know and say, hey, we would be nice if we were all making a little more, and we can see that you're profitable, right? Like there's profits there that like we think we should get a cut of, that it's just exploiting that opportunity, right? So whether or not you can say, because I'm sure Spotify can turn around and go like, you can't unionize because you're solopreneurs. And so yes, it's not a true union, but you're able to leverage the fact that there's this like shared interest on the artist side and a vested interest on the platform side to not lose all of the artists.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from there. And the services that we provide, if we're all lined up in our interests, is it possible for us to get a better deal? I agree that that's the aim of talking about it this way. We have explored how unlikely it is that will amount to anything, though, which is big issue with it, and that some of the demands were so off base, like the penny per stream thing doesn't work.
Right.
They've moved beyond that, but this is still existentially pretty weak tea. I want to talk about like live shows and stuff in a little bit as well, but we're just looking at this streaming side and how it kind of became this cause celeb for people to talk about being an artist as labor. Like, it really doesn't seem like it's going to work that well to keep approaching it this way. Because sure, I get it. Like, you want all the artists to negotiate against the bugaboos of the streaming platforms and their CEOs and all that stuff. Great. But how, when you're already, it's not even that you're negotiating with them as a solopreneur, it's that you're doing it like through a distributor where you already kind of clear your product into the distributor's huge pile of new songs that are coming out, and then the distributor feeds them to the streaming platforms. Like, it's a mess.
It is. And I think there are definitely ways that Umal loses me, right? Like, in principle, I am for what they are for. I wish artists were paid more. I wish Spotify's payouts worked differently. Again, a penny per stream, we've talked about as a bit ludicrous. That's just like make Taylor Swift even more of a billionaire, or Drake or whomever. Give them tons and tons of money.
Indeed,
doesn't really is not super feasible. So there's that. I guess the framing it as a, that there's potential for a union of musicians, or that musicians have this opportunity to collectivize, I think is more a useful framing and a useful story. Because I think, kind of like labor unions, right? You need someone at your company to first say, hey, doesn't it suck that we only get 2 weeks of vacation every year? And what if that could be different? And, because like your average, indie artist that's just uploading stuff to DistroKid by themselves, they get their $30 of streaming. Many art people are not actually thinking that hard about this, right? They just say like, okay, is what it is. That's not very much money when I make $30 a year from streaming. And it might take someone saying like, what if it was more? Or what if it worked differently? Or what if these platforms existed in different ways, or existed less, right? Which I'm not sure, as Yuma actually said that they want to, like, they would rather Spotify wasn't around. I'd be curious if they've got an official position on that.
I would be as well. Penny per stream was basically wishing for it to not be around de facto, because that
Right.
wouldn't work. But, nowadays there's the Living Wage for Musicians Act, which we talked about. Again,
Sure.
It's funny, living wage, like this is not a wage. There's nothing about this that's a wage setup situation, but that's the framing of it, because they want to get closer to the kinds of revenue that you can earn from that to being like what you could earn by working for a wage. So I guess that's how they come up with the framing. It makes sense that way. But that bill was kind of about adding on extra tax, or basically just doing something that makes the subscription more expensive for the listener, that adds more money into the pot. And then they're like really specific about where they want to direct that money. But in general, they would wish that there's more money in the pot. They don't necessarily wish that the streamers go raise their own prices or double them or whatever, but they would want to add on some tax there and then pool that money into a fund and pay it out through the Living Wage for Musicians Act. You know, I understand that to be the cause of the moment, and the effect of that, if they pass it and if the system somehow holds and that continues to operate, is that based on what gets streamed, the individual instrumentalists and contributors to the recording will end up getting a new stream of revenue out of that.
Yes. Which, like, you know, the Living Wage for Musicians Act, we talked about this, so we don't have to rehash the whole thing, but like, I think if nothing else is a neat idea, again, impractical probably as far as, and you'll have consequences beyond what probably even Yuma wants as far as labels and whatnot. But yeah, it's interesting to think about the problems of, you know, speaking about the groups of artists as if we are a collective when we're not. We just have this shared interest.
Yeah. Now, here's a great example of where music and labor intersected perfectly. And it was a long time ago now, but there are still some players, even here in our city of Vancouver, who are living right now, who earn pensions from their chapter of a musicians' union. And this was the ideal example of this working, where historically musicians were paid rates set by the union when they worked on studio sessions and did it for specific lengths of time for a call that you could get paid this rate for. And if you were on tour, you know, you could get paid by the week or by the day by the band leader or the company, and that would be stipulated as well when you're looking for those kind of gigs and taking the gigs. There's these set rates and these set employment situations for being a musician who plays in the studio on recordings and for going out on tour. And there are still musicians alive today who worked most of their careers in that situation and who now have a income supplement in their old age from having paid dues to a musicians union who administrated this. And it's like a museum piece to discuss it for us today, because it resembles so little the way that the situation is now. And I think that is very lamentable for the people who are very music labor oriented. And just in general, any older musician who likes to spend a lot of time on Facebook. So you can still hear about that.
Yeah, you'll hear many a person bemoaning the absence of the musicians union, which, like, hearing that all said, sounds pretty peachy, right? Set rates, you don't have to negotiate. You just, like, here's the going rate for the labor of going on a tour, for the labor of a day in the studio, a gig per hour. What's the case for the opposite of that? Everyone's an entrepreneur, we're all freelance. The libertarian.
What's my argument for why we should be in neo-lib land now and have torn that all up? I don't necessarily have one.
Okay.
But I mean, the key thing about those rates was that they were enough. They were substantial enough for artists who did that all the time. And there were enough gigs, of course. And today there are still enough gigs. There are tons of gigs, but the rates, they vary widely, for one thing. But also, by and large, they're not enough. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of the neoliberal story, you could definitely say. But it's because of how big the space has become and how many gigs there are. If you think about who is writing the check for all these different types of gigs. It's a whole bunch of different people. It's artists themselves who are like taking us and, you know, our friends who would do a studio session, taking us in a studio. We might not get paid at all, or we might get paid a little bit, or when would we get paid a lot? Well, it would be when there's a lot of grant funding subsidizing that cost. And this is true at so many levels in Canada, for sure, pretty much all the way to the top. You know, I think the only places where you would find this lifestyle with those kind of rates and the way that it used to work, I think the only places you would still find it, I mean, other than actually orchestral musicians, you know, the musicians union today functions for orchestral players. That's where it is very much still intact. But we're not talking about that because neither of us really know that much about that. But I think we can acknowledge that it does still kind of exist there today.
Yeah.
And there's that ecosystem. But the only place where you'd find it in popular music is like in a couple cities in the US, right? Like maybe in LA or New York. And maybe specifically for a lot of film sessions and things like that are kind of close to being an orchestral player. You know, not even for being like a New York jazz musician, certainly not anymore, because of the proliferation of all those gigs. But then even then, if you think about orchestral players, the reason why that's still able to work is because there's still so much scarcity. There's not that many of those gigs. There's extreme competition to get into those orchestras. And then when you get it, you know, it's still that union gig. But this is a cordoned off, scarce area of the industry. And nothing about it now is scarce. There's so many presenters putting on so many shows. There's so many artists doing it themselves. There's so many people playing. If you tried to bring back that world of the past into popular music today as we are participating in it, we would have so few gigs because so few presenters, record companies, other artists could afford to pay those kind of rates.
So it's kind of like a macroeconomic thing or an entertainment industry economic thing on top of just being, you know, there's like other material realities of this. I think there's also, you know, there's like informal rate setting. I remember when we were in music school, there'd be discussions about people taking gigs at venues that did not pay enough, right? I mean, I think like the Falconetti's gig was, I don't know if you ever did any of those. I believe famously it was like $50 for the whole band or something like that for a jazz.
You want to hear something that's even more depressing?
Yeah.
So if you adjust that for inflation, that's probably like what a lot of gigs are paying right now.
Oh man, yeah, I guess that's right because you know the rates haven't gone up. That was very bad at the time.
Even at the time.
Even at the time, that was very bad. And you know there was discussions about like people would take that and you would just go like maybe don't. You know, if it was a friend of yours, you'd say like, hey, I understood you probably needed that $50, which, you know, I was like $13 each or something for a whole band, depending on how many people you were playing with.
Oh, sorry. No, I was wrong. You were talking about like for $50 to $100 for the whole band. No, we're still not there. Inflation
it was 50. It was like 50 for the whole band. I'm not sure if that was every Falconetti's gig. That was one I heard about.
Never mind. No counterpoint to you. Yeah, no. That's ridiculous. Yeah, I forgot.
It was ridiculous. I didn't even the place isn't around anymore.
I was thinking per person.
Yes, discussions internally in the scene about like, hey, we should just like, people should just never say yes to that gig. Until they come back with more, right? Because as soon as someone says yes, they're effectively, even though there's no formal union, they're effectively sort of like, scabbing for the rest of the community, right? Like you're undercutting the rest of everyone else who's saying like, no, thank you. I would like at least 150 for the band if I'm playing with a trio. And even that's really low. So there was a bit of that informal kind of collective activity happening then. And you're right, like, you know, that venue just couldn't afford to pay the musicians, and that venue also probably couldn't afford to pay their rent, is why they're gone now. But that stuff was still happening, just more informally.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like, if that is a micro version of the wish, if it is the wish to have a lot fewer gigs and to have it be ultra competitive to get them and to still pay as much as possible for them. And the forces have been moving us in a different direction for decades now, where there's still tons and tons of gigs and they're easy to come and easier to go, and paying less along the way because there's so many of them, and there's more opportunities for people to come in and play. And there's a lot of tension there between that and to what extent is it good work, the ones that we do have, right? So this is an expression of a wish for there to be fewer opportunities overall, because that's a sacrifice you would want to make to try and preserve it as good work, as a professional thing to do. And this is a hard, it's a never ending problem, right? Like, you can't solve this problem. It will always be moving in one direction or the other.
I think we're once again outing ourselves as a pro gatekeeping podcast, where it's like, if you want gigs to pay better, there's a floor, right? And like, there's a floor of quality and ability. And obviously when we were in music school and starting out, it was great to have venues that did not have a high floor of ability, because that's how you would get to practice, right? And that felt like a universal good. And any sort of gatekeeping to say like, it's like this gig's maybe above our ability would feel, not fun. Like, not, being gatekept like that did not feel good. But to get on the other side, and to be fair, I'm saying, like, if we get to a state in this city, especially, where like the floor goes, I will be left behind, right? Like, I don't play full time. So the things that we're discussing, like, would not involve me. I would not be a beneficiary of the smaller scene, higher rates.
You want the opportunities to play, right?
Yeah, I love playing.
Yeah.
But I also see that comes with, it's a double-edged sword. Comes with the lower rates for other people I care about that should also be making more.
Yeah, there's so much revealed preference, though. That's the thing, for people wanting more gigs, because when they come up, people take them. And how much gatekeeping is it possible to do on that front? Because it's so everywhere. Think of all the different people who are putting on gigs that are below a lot of people's lines of saying that it's good work. Like, it would be, all the way down from restaurants, of course, through like municipalities, cities, neighborhood business associations and functions and things like that. Only the highest end functions would preserve it as like a super well playing, like, casual gig, right? Like, there's so many more different kinds of casual gigs that pay a lot less. I mean, if you rewound the clock, you would find that even like bar gigs would pay well and you could play enough of them and stuff. But that is really just an inflation story, right? Like, there's nothing music specific that you can do to try and fight that. Like, it's very much swimming upstream, because that, if you talk about that, that's really just the overall inflation story.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about the counterfactual of, if there were less, we can remember, you and I, one time when it felt a little bit dry, as far as we're talking about jazz gigs at the moment, but it felt a little bit dry in the scene, right? Where like Merge or Verge, what's the name of that venue that was on Clark and
so the very small creative one was Merge. Yeah.
Merge, not Verge. Merge had closed. There were a couple others that had, like, I think right around this time, Cellar closed as well. There was a bit of a dearth before Frankie started. And in that case, it's a small enough scene that I didn't have an immediate, like, rates didn't go crazy high, but it didn't feel very fun, right? There was just like this, pretty small list of where to go see music. Some of our favorite places were either like not super available or whatever, and everyone wished that there was just more happening. And now that there is, obviously there's the other side of the double-edged sword, which is some of these gigs don't pay great, and maybe that has this depressive effect on the rest of the scene as well, right? I also, as we were talking about this, it's funny to talk as, like, I'm going to use a term like quote unquote professionals, even though like music is not my full-time job, but we are in a scene of people who it is their livelihood. That if all of these people, collectivized and said, hey, we're not going to take gigs for less than X amount, we're not going to do this. There's like an infinite well of like dad bands and guys in their 60s who have like replica Led Zeppelin guitars, and like it's easy to think, and of course, but like many restaurants, they don't care. Like those gigs, the absence will not be felt as strongly as we wish that it was.
Yeah, like we think that the kind of jazz gigs that we were talking about are the bottom of the barrel. No, the barrel goes a lot deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. And like these restaurants that, host us and we provide a service to and would like to assume there's some scarcity. Not really. They'll happily get a much worse band in there that doesn't know anything about our kind of collective scene work and whatnot. So I think that's the eternal struggle for musicians.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even have to isolate to the jazz scene too in this mid 2010s time period that you're talking about. I think we could easily come up with like what are the indie venues that closed at the time that left a lot of people. I mean, I recently completed a project that had been on my to-do list for a long time, which was for a little bit I've produced a podcast called Pacific Sound Radio with co-founder James Olson, and it's the longest running active podcast dedicated to music interviews in BC now, because he started it in 2017 and he's kept it going now. And I finally recovered over 80 episodes of the back catalog, like episode 1 to 82. I finally put them onto the main podcast feed so that the entire 167 episode history of the show's in one place for the first time ever, because they used to record it on some different networks live in some different locations. And I listened to some of the old episodes and you could hear them expressing the sentiment very often. And it was a great reminder of how common it was at the time. They would talk about, actually some of the ones that have closed now were still going. Like they would talk about the Railway Club. The Railway Club was still there at the time, but it eventually closed too on Dunsmuir Street in downtown Vancouver. But I think some of the big ones where they would talk about there was a venue called the Media Club that I think was a very good, I mean, it was almost like a Tyrant Studios for the jazz community in terms of the role it had for indie bands. I think like it was a small place where you could get a gig and do well, but it was still small and it was cool. So the Media Club, was a place that closed. There was a place called Stylus Records, I think was the name of it. That I think
played Stylus
mixed reputation
with Wildfire. Yeah, that was a good venue. Fun venue.
Okay.
I don't know about good. It was fun.
Good Stylus for what Records, it was.
Stylus Records was in a basement. It was a record store, and I assume the record store's also not there now that the venue's not there. Kind of like right behind or beside where Red Truck Brewing is, like on 2nd, I guess, and Main. And man, fun. Played some fun shows with Wildfire, David Lavoie's former indie band.
Yeah, so they were talking about venues of the day that were going away too, and that feeling was not just isolated to our scene. I think there was something a little bit broader, more secular even about it. It'd be interesting to know what timeline other, the 2 or 3 other major Canadian cities feel. I don't know if Toronto music heads feel like there's a similar timeline, or if they would think it's a little bit different. I'm curious about that now. Actually, I haven't been exposed to that. I don't really know.
Yeah, it'd be fun to kind of investigate that, the timeline. I think there were some very Vancouver specific things. I mean, I know there was some of that coincided with Vancouver real estate speculation. So some venues and some neighborhoods that housed venues were beginning to get snatched up by developers. And, I'm a pro housing. I don't think that's a terrible thing always to have more housing. Sometimes it was types of housing, like luxury condominiums or whatever, that it didn't feel great to replace. I mean, Redgate, famously, the old Redgate location was bought by Chip Wilson's development firm, and people were not thrilled about that. And I still have some good idea for anti-Chip Wilson merch that I'll get manufactured one day, but.
But will you get there before I do Rhythm Changes t-shirts or not? That's the real question. Maybe.
I'm sure you'll beat me. I'm sure you'll beat me to it. Maybe that'll be this podcast's first merch. Is my idea is Chimp Wilson. It's just chimpanzee. That's the whole shirt. That's the idea.
There's got to be some kind of MailChimp Wilson joke in here too, because of podcasts and MailChimp. There's got to be something there.
We can get a good sponsorship. So I think at the time in Vancouver, I'm sure Toronto was going through a similar real estate thing. but there's less scarcity, I think, of places, like less of the kind of tear down and build a condo in Toronto, because Toronto is already quite dense. And so I think there are some specific Vancouver things for a couple of those venues that I know were just like Vancouver real estate and development speculation.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of want to talk about the Cultural Land Trust now. Do you want to do a quick hit on it? Do you think we could
Sure.
wrap that in? I think it's relevant. We mentioned it before, but we tabled it. I almost want to pull it
Yeah.
out now
Yeah. Yeah.
and mention it. So this is an idea that we alluded to in a previous episode. It becomes relevant. We were talking about what we were just talking about. And in my opinion, I think this is one of the strongest arguments that this activist community has. Like, I think that this is one of the areas where I would like to see it focus on, because I think it has merit. I mean, it's not a perfect idea, but I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And this is an idea that is kind of born in Vancouver or led in Vancouver by a pretty popular YouTuber as well. And I think that's where we both found out about it. I don't think
Yep.
we actually found out about it through our peers or anything necessarily, but they have a website at culturallandtrust.ca, which I'll link out to. And the conceit of this idea is that there is a category of place called artist spaces, and that they are in valuable areas and they're salvaged from types of real estate units, that you can get access to for kind of random reasons, or that you can kind of find as diamonds in the rough you could never afford to pay a market rent for, and these are the artist spaces that have been known for decades and have been underwriting different cultural scenes. And we all kind of understand that because we've been to them. The Cultural Land Trust Project notes that many of them have closed around this time period that we are currently discussing,
Yep.
and also notes that it's unlikely that in this specific area of land, like real estate's all about location, unlikely that in this specific area of land, because of market forces, that we will be able to find these kind of places again in this area. This may sound obvious, but I mean, it's not, because in past decades, we have been able to turn over new spaces like this every once in a while. Like, for example, in Vancouver, the emergence of Green Auto, it's an example of a space and a location you can't really recreate. They do still crop up every once in a while, but it's becoming less and less likely that we can get new spaces like this over time, because the selection and the economic environment has become more intense over time.
Yes.
Therefore, Cultural Land Trust movement seeks to make sure there are still enough places to have a vibrant scene, which is another thing you could debate, like how many places do you need? What's the nature of these places? How important is it? If we ended up with like 0 of them, how bad would that be? That's kind of an open question, right? But this is a movement in BC, and they state that by 2050 they want to have raised enough funds or found enough partners that they can own part or all of, they say, 30 properties in BC. They want to be governed by a board that has diverse representation of different parts of the economic equation, like including artists and, like a co-op style board model. And then this nonprofit will be the owner and operator of these spaces, because there'll be a literal owner in them, real estate. So they have to get a lot of money. They say they need 15 million to be on track to accomplish that. But their combination of, I guess, not literally co-op, but like collective governance of these properties, and raising the funds and then using them to identify key properties and purchase them, is one way that they can offset the loss of these spaces. So that's the Cultural Land Trust model as I understand it.
So you're effectively taking these spaces off the market, holding them in a trust that kind of governs how they're used, who gets to live there.
And you can kind of rent control them, therefore, too, to some extent, or you can avoid the extreme pressures of rent increasing astronomically.
Exactly. And if a developer comes to you and says, like, there could be some sort of constitution in the trust as well, that if a developer comes to you and offers you like 3x your investment in that, you just go like, no, sorry, not for sale. Like, we're not selling, even though that would be foolish from a business standpoint, but you're not a business, you're a trust.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think Vancouver's a really interesting case for this because, the usual, I was just in Calgary thinking about the gentrification cycle, right? Where like the area, expands, becomes hip, people go out further into less developed areas. Artists first move in, friends of the artist, those become like hipper areas, and then the area gentrifies, pushing people further out. And especially the original residents can no longer afford to live in the neighborhood and they move out. And Vancouver's been through like many gentrification cycles. Like the neighborhood I live in at like Hastings and Nanaimo would have not been a great place to live even 20 or 30 years ago. I bought a piece of furniture from someone who used to live on this block, and he was like, "Oh, must be really different now," because he was like, he wouldn't. I was like, "Oh yeah, I love it, Hastings Sunrise," and he was like, "Oh," he was like, "Yeah, it was not a safe or nice place to live when he was growing up." So Vancouver, but it's basically done now, and there are very few spaces. And Vancouver obviously is geographically bound both by like other cities and mountains and water, so you can't keep expanding outward like a Calgary. So yeah, you're kind of left with these options, and it's such a desirable city real estate wise that the market's going to keep on, the amount of money coming into the market is going to keep on making it almost impossible to just hang on to property and not sell.
But this is why I wanted to pick this off as like an example of this labor subject we were already talking about, right? Because if you think of if artist types want to collectively organize for better conditions, where else could they have more of an impact than if they could pull off something like this? Like if I kind of see the streaming advocacy as futile ultimately, but something like this, it's a big goal. And actually, they're on the culturallandtrust.ca website. I did notice there were link outs to some other similar organizations in other cities in the US that I haven't checked out, that I might want to check out and see how far along they've gotten. Like, this is not an easy thing to do, and it needs a lot of funding, but it is this. Like, it is the idea of, even if it isn't strict labor employer-employee relations, what are the areas where artists can organize for better outcomes, and like what would they want to do? Space and stewardship of space is like one of the top goals, you'd have to say. So that's why I think it's an interesting representation of this subject and this struggle.
It is, and it's interesting to hear you speak. I'm surprised to hear you speak positively about the idea. I understand you think there's issues with it, but I think when we first brought it up, you were a lot more bearish on the idea than you're speaking now. So I think it's very rad, and I think, there are, the Arc is maybe the biggest example in East Van of like a live artist space, and that's kind of like rent controlled, and you need a grant to live there. And you get this crazy tax break on your rent if you have your studio set up in your apartment. And like, that's very cool, but that's like the person who runs the Arc or who owns it, it's just kind of on their goodwill, right? They could turn around one day if they need the money and sell that for millions, which, would be a huge bummer for the artist living there. But a trust kind of prevents those incentives.
Yeah, it would allow for long-term governance, which I guess is, and they talk about like how short leases are and how rent increases break things and stuff all the time. I mean, I'm not, the thing about like subsidized rental or like affordable housing and things like that, the tough thing about it is that if there's not enough housing, then those are units that could be out on the market, and trying to help the market rents from going up too much. So that's tough. It's like you need more housing across the board to keep that from getting even worse, right? Yeah. But in terms of what's already there, it's a legitimate strategy for artists' interests is to try and lock in places like that, manage them that way. It doesn't really help the whole picture, but it is a place where artists can advocate for their interests. And if an organization like this manages to raise like 15, 20, 30 million dollars to this aim, like that's really impressive. And two, like that would create some new institutions in Vancouver, and who knows, what other opportunities could come out of that.
Absolutely. It's community building. It's that, it's a collective action success if it works out. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So if we run down, I mean, I thought if we needed to, we could have did this at the beginning. But if we just run down like a list of like, is this labor? Do we think this is labor or not? Let's start with like some easy ones. These are like different roles, different hats that you can wear when you are about this life. You know, is being a teacher or music educator or some variety, is that labor?
Oh yeah. 100%.
Yes, of course it is. And you're represented by a union in this province and in many.
Yeah, exactly.
Is being like a music writer in the traditional sense, like not the way I am, but like if you're writing for publications and things like that, is that labor?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would say.
Absolutely it is. And that's why there's New Feeling, which is a organization that I watch from afar and I'm not involved in at all, but we've talked about New Feeling, right?
Not on the pod, but yeah.
Yeah, newfeeling.ca. It's a cooperative of disaffected music. I have my views about New Feeling of music journalists across Canada who are pooling together their time, passion, energy, know-how to put out like issues of Canadian indie music journalism, and they've been doing that post-COVID now for like 3 or 4 years.
Awesome.
Because of course the labor conditions in that market have changed a lot.
Yes.
Is being a recording artist, is it labor?
I'm going to say yes. I mean, so are you a recording, like a session artist, or a recording artist like self?
So this is a good question, right? Let's take the latter one first. Is being a session player, is it labor?
Session player is labor, 100%.
Yeah, it is. Even and that environment has gotten a lot harder, and the rates have become a lot more unequal, and there's this big bottom end of it where you're not making very much. So, but yeah, no, it is labor being a session musician. Undoubtedly, you're showing up at a place and you're playing for however much you're getting paid. So being a session musician is totally labor. I was thinking though, being a recording artist where it's your name and you're putting out the album and you're the leader.
I think if you were to break down the composite parts of being a recording artist,
yeah,
I think you will come out net. Like, is sending emails to get promo, is that labor? Kind of. Again, this is maybe my definition of labor is broader than yours. I think doing work to affect outcomes, even if you're not in an employer-employee relationship. So I'm going to say like doing the emails, that's labor. Being in the studio, that's labor. Writing the songs, that's labor. There's some things you could say that you're just doing for yourself that I'd have a harder time defending. But I think if you outline all those components, you're going to get over 50% labor. And I'm going to say being a recording artist is labor. But I think we might disagree there.
Yeah, because I don't think it is.
Yeah.
And that's because I'm so fixated on looking at who you're working for, which is the issue with the way that I'm looking at it. Because, there's all these tasks, of course, that somebody has to do. But that's being a recording artist. That's like right in the middle of the spectrum of like how easy it is to say what is. Is composing music, writing songs, is that labor?
I think it depends. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say the act of doing it is labor, even if you're not employed to do it. But
wow. Okay.
I think so. You wake up in the morning and that's your job. And that's what you do is you wake up and you compose. I think you're working. I think you're laboring. Although again, not in your definition of employer-employee. But if you're self-employed, you're laboring.
Well, this is like, you go back 80 to 100 years and yeah, it could have been more obviously labor, in the Tin Pan Alley era.
Sure.
But if you think about like writing your own music and stuff, to me, it seems like the most obvious example of non-labor because you're just creating IP or whatever, if you think about it. And then it ends up being exploitable depending on other labor that ends up going into it to place it in different parts of the world and to make it into different things.
Right. So you're saying with that, I mean, again, I'm using a very wide, maybe overly wide in my definition of labor, but I think hearing what my composer and songwriter friends do, I'm like, that's work. More work than what I do at my job that pays me a salary.
Yeah, there's a reason why we're not saying like, oh, is this work? Because it can all be work. Yes. And if you're doing it at a high level, it is all work. And it all takes a lot of it and a high caliber of work to make any of it happen, which hopefully was the unsaid premise of everything we're saying here.
Yeah.
Neither of us are arguing that it's not hard work. That's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any other hats that we need to throw into this, or are those kind of the big ones?
I talked about session. I think session musician kind of covers your gigging musicians, because I think you could say the same thing about that. Yeah. I think that's it. If you're an A&R at a label, is that labor?
Yeah, you have a salary probably.
Yeah.
Who's paying it? Canada Council.
Yeah.
Factor.
Yeah, usually. If you're an artist, if you're a freelance artist manager, is that labor?
Because you don't make a wage if you're doing that. You're making a rev share effectively. You're calling it like a commission or a fee.
Yeah.
But yeah, artist management is interesting that way. It's an area that I know probably the least about of like all the equations. Artist management, because I also don't know that much about booking agents. I have some friends who are booking agents. I was in a band that booked ourselves, so I know a little bit about that. But, I know a little bit about booking agents. I know very little about artist management as a profession, because I've never worked with a group that had one. Yeah. It is kind of an unexplored territory for me. But I know that they make basically a rev share, like 10, 15, or 20% would be a common range.
You're kind of working for the band that you're managing on some level, although the lines are harder to draw. I would say that's labor.
Yeah, the compensation is different, but yeah, I would agree it is also labor. Just because of the way it's compensated in that case, no, it doesn't mean that it's not labor. It is.
Yeah. Interesting.
Do you think this still happens where young bands still think that they need to have a manager? This happened in a prior decade. It would be something that people would talk about as like, oh, we've made it if we have a manager, like that's what will help us. Do people still think about that? I don't know.
Have I told you this story about Tour de France got approached by a manager right kind of as our one song was doing quite well, that someone reached out and said, hey, we'd like to have a conversation. And the outcome was, this person was really nice, and the outcome was like, Luke and I were basically not serious enough about making it our full-time career to justify continuing that conversation, right?
Oh, I think you did mention this in the careerism episode. Yeah, you didn't really talk about it at length, but you were like, oh yeah, we weren't going to be going full-time into this.
Yeah, you asked, this was a very earnest, like this person was not a big showbiz person. He had worked with other artists, some of whom I are like semi-famous and respected, and asked if we would be interested in like producing for singers and stuff. We said yeah, sure, and asked a little more about like, hey, what would you be open to doing, like more social media, that kind of thing, because that's obviously part of what you're worried about as a manager. And we were like, not really, like we don't. The more we thought about it, the more we were like, you know what, I don't really want this band or this house music project to be my full-time job. We both had full-time jobs that we liked well enough, and so that was where we kind of left it with that. But it was an interesting conversation. I had no idea really at the time even what a manager would do for me. But if you get to a certain in pop music, certainly, or dance music, like someone eventually reaches out and will say, hey, you need a manager, even if you can ignore them, but it does happen.
That is interesting to me, because I think of it as being such the thing where if you're the manager and you have to reach out, that means you're NGMI, as the Bitcoiners say, or whatever. It means because, you have to have people coming to you. And if you didn't, that would be a very kind of adverse selection kind of thing in the way that I would think about it, So I'm not surprised really that it wasn't enticing to you, or that it didn't work out for you. I get it. Like if you're a manager, of course you got to find clients, but I definitely see it as like a bit of a red flag if they're reaching out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I wonder if that's changed a little more. I have one friend who's kind of in the pop music space doing all right. And I think she said she's had tried it both ways, with a manager, without a manager, and has had positive experiences, in both cases, and negative experiences, both ways. But it's interesting that it still kind of goes on like that.
I think maybe artists used to do this too, but I think maybe nowadays it might be more common to hire legal services at specific points when you need them, But in the past, if that wasn't as available to you, if you weren't just able to like get a lawyer when you needed one and not like on an ongoing basis, that a manager was more important because you needed legal services more often, or you know, they needed to hook that up for you in some way, and as an artist you wouldn't be able to do it yourself. So maybe that might be an area where it's changed a little bit and there's not as much need for a manager.
Yeah exactly.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this right now. I can talk about this because it will be out when we publish this episode, but I just interviewed Katie George, vocalist, Juno winner, friend of Rhythm Changes, and she was talking about having a manager. And so I was thinking about that. Her manager is Celine Peterson, who's Oscar Peterson's daughter.
Wow,
Lives back east. Has been like a radio host and is one of those people who does a whole bunch of different things in jazz and kind of runs in that like Lila Bialio Star Project kind of Canadian jazz circles, I guess. But I was just scrolling through what Katie said about working with Celine, and Katie was saying, oh yeah, Celine is awesome, helps advance the gigs, gets all the necessary information for everything, kind of seems to be a bit of a publicist as well, integrates that, is the point of contact for booking. So it sounds like they don't always book all her gigs all the way through, but they filter them and they advance them for her, and then she can make her own decisions about the gigs, especially in the US. And then so that is a part of Katie's team, that she kind of has somebody who can do a little bit of everything. And I guess the manager is like the generalist on the artist team, and if you're operating at that level, I can imagine it could be really helpful.
Definitely. And I think there are artists who have their strong suits, and, you know, sometimes having someone on your team who can fill in a gap if you think you might have a gap, or something, an aspect of labor that you don't want to do for yourself, right? I think we've all been in that position of working for ourselves as musicians, going like, man, I wish there was someone else to send this email. And like, eventually, if you're at a certain level of success, you can hire that person.
There's grant writers too, I suppose. You know, this is also an area that maybe I don't know the full picture of, because, you know, I've been an employee at nonprofits and I've had to work on their grants. You know, I work on some grant related things for some of my clients now, but like I've never been an out and out grant writer. I've also rarely worked with them. I know a couple of artists who that is like their main kind of income generating service, is that they work on a lot of other people's grants. You can do that by charging flat fees, or you could take a commission or a rev share even too, depending on how it works. So in Canada especially, I think that's an area where you could bring somebody in if you have something very large that you're already doing or trying to do. You know, that's maybe that's one of the first people, you know, instead of like a manager. You're probably going to want to hire a grant writer if you have artist ambitions in Canada before you try and hire a manager or booking agent or anything like that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be a better use of money, especially in this space, in the creative and jazz music world.
Yeah. So that's our discussion of music plus labor. Do you have any closing thoughts? We've obviously solved the problem in its entirety, and we can put it to bed.
Yeah, I was going to say, glad we completely ironed that out, whether music is labor or not. No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think it's a really interesting discussion. I think maybe my takeaway is like, it's interesting to think about how one feels about, you know, you, Mom. And I think talking about the example of the, you know, trust, housing trust, that, you know, one can think about what your best use of time as a, you know, collectivizing action, right? If we're all artists who have limited time, limited resources, think about how you want to collectivize, right? And there's some pretty cool material ways you can do that, and ways that are maybe going to have a little less impact.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw down the gauntlet on this too, because we're both kind of in this buckets, different extents. But, you know, if you are a part-time artist and if you have another source of revenue, especially if it's a stable one that is not tied to your artistic pursuits, hire as much labor as you can. Don't make yourself do all the tedious parts of the picture. Hire it out to other people and have people working with you on your artistic stuff. One, that'll help you enjoy it as much as possible. And two, that will be a piece of the puzzle for those people that you're working with, and it kind of contributes to the ecosystem. That can look so many different ways. It can look from somebody like you and me to paying somebody like $100 to help them on a grant for a little bit, all the way up to like, the people who invested on Corey Weeds' Jazz Cellar with Corey when he was younger, in his 20s.
Totally.
And he took over the business. There's all kinds of different opportunities for people to kind of play around with having teammates when they go and make artistic projects, when their P&L doesn't depend on it.
Yeah, that's a great call out. And I mean, I've had the pleasure of getting to hire someone to like mix David and I's album last year, which was a great use of funds that hopefully helped someone, pay their bills.
Yeah. All right, man. Do you have a recommendation to go out on here?
I do. I got some solid Canadian indie rock. The rock band Foxwarren, led by Andy Schaaf, who's maybe more famous than his side project Foxwarren, dropped a new album last week. I'm enjoying it. Solid, good old indie rock. I love Andy Schaaf. Many listeners, I'm sure, will know who he is and already enjoy his music. It's worth a listen.
Nice. I have another sports-related one, because this week that this is coming out, it is the start of the CFL season, the Canadian Football League.
Oh.
And I would like to read in its entirety a post that I made on my secret blog at the start of the last CFL season. Actually, I'm looking at it now, it was in July of 2024. So it was midway through the last CFL season that I came up with this. I would like to read it into the record of Upsample in its entirety. The
Please.
Canadian Football League is the jazz of sports. It has a century-plus history as a popular cultural product, but it's not that popular relative to the top entertainment. Obscure rules and conventions define its form relative to other spectacles. The players, by and large, are not household names, but they and the teams have hardcore fans. There are few outlets covering it, meaning that hardcore fans will have to coalesce around smaller stations of content and go to primary sources for most information. No one's getting rich. They're in it for the love, not for the money. Or they're trying to cut their teeth, get an education, and then make a better living in a similar genre south of the border.
Yeah, that's really good.
So I'll be watching the CFL starting real soon.
Amazing. Just in time for Jazz Fest.
Yep. Yeah. And with that, we are out. We are going to be back next week with a new episode. This having been episode 10. We have entered the double-digit club. Have a great day.
You have a great day as well. Take it easy.